Thank you. May I invite the Reverend Adnir Jones, who is here with us and also sits on the commission, to come and offer prayers.
Good morning. Could you let us join in prayer, please? Our Father, we gather this morning in your name. We gather concerning this most important area of our national life, the sanctity of life, the prevention of violence, the building of peace, and the gifting of goodwill in our nation. We thank you, Lord, that it is you who have gathered us and has guided us to this point in the work of the Commission and in the unfolding of future engagements. We give ourselves to you today. We stand together, representative of our whole nation, and ask, Lord, for your guidance and for your special help to tackle a severe challenge among us, to find the path to peace, to build hope, and to give hope to our nation. So we pray today in the word of your prophet Jeremiah 29:7. Seek the prosperity of the place where you live. Pray for it, for if it prospers, you will prosper too. We claim the spirit of the anthem and of the pledge and of the national song. We pray for grace as we engage in this time of review and reflection, and pray you grant us help in our shared concerns, and also, Lord, in our shared declaration of aspirations. Through this meeting today, help our nation to find the spaces for equality and equity, for justice and peace, for goodwill, brotherhood and sisterhood, to be family, to be community. We thank you for our commissioners. We thank you for Professor Sams Vaughan, who has been leading us ably. We thank you for the validation that today will bring, and ask you now to bless this ceremony and all of its details. Through the name of Jesus Christ, our Lord, we pray. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen gathered here, you may be seated. And, as an exclamation mark to Reverend Jones's prayer, I recalled the Bible also says, seek peace and pursue it. And so this morning we are here gathered just to do that. So this really is the first public presentation of the National Violence Prevention, or let me say it right, because so many people have so many derivatives. It's the National Commission on Violence Prevention, a safe, civil, and violence-free society. Good morning to you and welcome to the banquet hall here at Jamaica House. My name is Naomi Francis, and I'll guide you through our proceedings this morning. And let me tell you as well who is here with us. We have, of course, the Most Honorable Andrew Holness, Prime Minister, Senator Peter Bunting, the Member of Parliament, I beg your pardon, the Leader of Government Business in the Senate. Let me go right again. Senator Peter Bunting, the Leader of Opposition Business in the Senate. The Honorable... The Honorable Favor Williams, the Minister of Education and Youth, a lady who has been elevated, and I want to this morning pause for special congratulations and commendations to the Honorable Audrey Sewell, the Permanent Secretary here at the Office of the Prime Minister, who will join us shortly, as well as now Professor the Honorable Maureen Sams Vaughan, Chairman of the Commission of the National Violence Prevention Commission. Prof, We are absolutely proud of you. Congratulations. Well deserved. A round of applause, everybody. We also have in our midst Mr. Wayne Robertson, the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Legal and Constitutional Affairs. We have members of the diplomatic missions and international organizations that are also here with us. ACP Desmond Brooks, representing the Police Commissioner. Dr. Charlene Kaur Desai, the consultant with the Commission. Ms. Antoinette Richards, the Planning Institute of Jamaica. Mr. Fabian Vassell, the research manager here at the National Commission on Violence Prevention, and other members of the Commission, heads of agencies and other special guests and stakeholders, members of the media or wider viewing audience on traditional and social media, and or Zoom participants. I believe there are now over 40 Zoom participants, as well as, of course, those joining on social and traditional media. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe I covered everybody. Good morning to you. No, man, come again. Good morning to you. You're in the best month of the year. You know, it's Independence Month, and it's the month of great people, too. Marcus Garvey, I will put that, Marcus Garvey first, his birthday is coming up, but too, yeah, there are other great birthdays that come in the month of August. So this morning, ladies and gentlemen, we're pleased to give you here in our audience at the banquet hall and, of course, the wider Jamaica, an update on the work of the Commission. It's been a long and rough road because they have been looking at the issue, dissecting the issue, coming up with novel approaches and novel ways of looking at it and recommendations to present to the government. And let me tell you who the commissioners are. The head of the commission, and you'll see the photos on screen and we'll give you the captions as well, Professor the Honorable Maureen Sams Vaughan, now OJ, she's the chairman, as well as Mrs. Patricia Duncan Sutherland, Dr. Rebecca Tortello, Dr. Deanna Ashley, Dr. Herbert Gale, Mrs. Nancy Pinchas, Professor Anthony Harriott, Reverend Dr. Richard Keane, Ms. Antoinette Richards, Ms. Kelly Magnus, Reverend Adnir Jones, Mr. Stephen McCubin, and Mrs. Maria Love. So these are the commissioners, and we also have, as part of the commission, regular members, Mr. Richard Troop of the Ministry of Education, and Ms. Shona Trowers. And very importantly, to assist in terms of the technical team working with the commission, Mr. Fabian Vassell, Research Manager, Ms. Alicia Palma, Senior Research Officer, Ms. Erica Harris, Research Officer, and Ms. Shanice Salmon, Administrative Assistant. So there are the people who are working to ensure that this is not just another commission. It's important. The issue of violence, the Prime Minister says, should be treated as a pandemic. And really and truly, we really want to get to the heart of it to ensure that we not just talk about it, we not just put piecemeal approaches to it, but we seek peace and pursue it. And so, ladies and gentlemen, let's now start off. Mr. Fabian Vassell, the research manager, will give us an overview of the work of the commission. Mr. Vassell.
Thank you, Madam Master of Ceremonies, Ms. Naomi Francis. The Most Honorable Andrew Holness, Prime Minister of Jamaica. Senator Peter Bunting, representing the Leader of Opposition. Honorable Fayvel Williams, Minister of Education and Youth. The Honorable Audrey Swell, Permanent Secretary, Office of the Prime Minister. Mr. Wayne Robertson, Permanent Secretary, Minister of Legal and Constitutional Affairs, heads of the diplomatic missions and international organizations, Professor the Honorable Maureen Sams Vaughan, Chair and Commissioner of the National Commission on Violence Prevention, ACP Desmond Brooks, representing the Commissioner of Police, Dr. Charlene Kaur Desai, Consultant, Ms. Antoinette Richards, Planning Institute of Jamaica, and Commissioner of the Ncvp, heads of public agencies, and other special guests and stakeholders, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to be standing here to give you an overview of the Ncvp. Now, violence has been a grave problem for us here in Jamaica. We know how much it has affected our economy and how concerned our people are. The graph on screen shows a line graph with homicide rates from 1990 to 2020. If we take a good look at the line graph, as much as there are some ups and downs movement in the graph, we can pick up the general trend that the homicide rate is on an increase over the long term. The high level of violence in our country is really intolerable, and we must do something about it. Now, the impact of violence on our society is very negative. We know it. Violence negatively impacts mortality and morbidity rates. It negatively impacts health and education sector. It negatively impacts the social and financial systems in our country, reducing both social and human capital, impairing the development of our country. Now, there have been many interventions over the past. There have been many international treaties that Jamaica has signed to. Some of these include the United Nations Development Declaration in 2000, the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, developed by the United Nations. There are other international treaties. For example, in 1990, Jamaica signed the United Convention on the Right of the Child. In 2005, Jamaica signed the Convention for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. In 2015, Jamaica adopted the SDGs goals with 2030 as its target. And in 2016, there was a global partnership to end violence against children. Now, this led to Jamaica being recognized as a Pathfinder country and the only one in the Caribbean. So it meant that Jamaica is committed to use evidence-based, data-driven approaches and collaborative actions to achieve safety for all children. Now, other interventions over the past include the Citizen Security and Justice Program, CSJP, Behavior Modification Initiative, Child and Adolescents Abuse Mitigation Program, Integrated Community Development Program. So there have been many programs and interventions. We have some national policies and plans that were put forward. For example, Vision 2020 had some objectives that were geared towards violence prevention. the Independent Commission of Investigation was formed. The Major Organized Crime and Anti-Corruption Agency was also formed. There were law reforms. There's a national security policy, national crime prevention and community safety, among others. Now, we have seen all these interventions. The real problem is that we do appreciate the efforts made by persons making these interventions, but we still have a problem with high crime rates in our country. And that is what we're trying to tackle. There was a national consensus on crime, where the private sector, civil society, the government, the opposition came together to make plans to fight crime and violence. Now, recognizing these problems and recognizing that violence prevention is critical in the reduction of crime and violence in our country, it was the Prime Minister of Jamaica that established the National Commission on Violence Prevention, the Ncvp. And it was established to study the problem of violence in Jamaica, the existing strategies being used to reduce violence, to make realistic and attainable recommendations, to specifically target attitudinal and behavioral changes in society. So the purpose of the Ncvp, therefore, is to document the many initiatives related to violence prevention, behavioral and cultural change, to review the government of Jamaica's strategy and plans, and to formulate and make recommendations to the government of Jamaica. The Ncvp has taken on the public health approach to violence prevention, as set out by the World Health Organization. Now, with the public health approach, there are 3 levels of prevention. There's primary prevention, secondary, and tertiary. At the primary prevention level, what we look at is how can we prevent the violence from happening. We don't want it to happen, so we try to prevent it before it happens. At the secondary level, after a violent act has happened, what we try to do is to intervene as quickly as possible to minimize the short-term effects. At the tertiary level, well, if a violent act has happened, we try to intervene to minimize the long-term effects. The Ncvp also adopted the ecological model for understanding violence. Now, the ecological model starts with individual characteristics. Now, if we can understand the individual characteristics, then we start to think about relationship characteristics. Then we start to think about community level characteristics, and then eventually societal level characteristics. If we can take these different approaches, then we can significantly impact violence prevention. Now, the scope of work for the Ncvp. Is to conduct continuing comprehensive review of existing governmental and non-governmental violence prevention programs and violence prevention plans and studies, as well as the government of Jamaica's strategies and plans. We want to identify gaps in the prevention and intervention services and to make recommendations with respect to violence prevention, interventions, and intervention programs. We want to also advise on framework to collect and integrate data towards violence prevention. The scope of the work continues with establishing a method to transition violence prevention service providers towards evidence-based national best practices focusing on outreach and prevention, and to consult with the relevant officers within the ministries, departments, and agencies, and NGOs, civil society groups, and request relevant presentations on pertinent subjects from time to time. Now, the strategic map for the NCVP will show the NCVP terms of reference and the strategic objectives, but these objectives are aligned with Vision 2030 objectives. Now, there are some general objectives set out by the World Health Organization recommended for violence prevention. And some of these objectives are outlined here. We'll just move right to the specific objectives for the NCVP. Thank you. There are 9 outcome-focused objectives for the NCVP. The first objective is to determine if legislative and policy support for violence prevention is adequate. The second objective is to make violence prevention programs evidence-based. The third objective deals with adequate social protection and development systems, while the fourth objective looks at making public education on violence prevention available to all. The fifth objective looks at developing strategies to make comprehensive and current data available to facilitate evidence-based decisions, while the sixth objective looks at designing strategies to improve cooperation, coordination, and collaboration among violence prevention stakeholders. The seventh objective looks at determining cost and cost-benefit of violence prevention and violence prevention interventions. The eighth objective looks at determining cultural norms and values that promote a peaceful society. The ninth and final objective looks at making a comprehensive 10-year action plan for violence prevention. So the NCVP, along with its technical team, are working assiduously to carry out this mission, to complete these objectives, and to develop that comprehensive 10-year plan with all the recommendations. Ladies and gentlemen, this is just a brief overview of the NCVP. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mr. Vassell, for your comprehensive overview of the work of the National Commission on Violence Prevention. Some people turn it around and say National Violence Prevention Commission. It's really the National Commission on Violence Prevention. You know, I had a very interesting discussion recently with one of our academics who was very firm in saying that you have to measure what matters. And there's also a book called Measuring What Matters. And so the National Commission on Violence Prevention is very determined, keen, and I believe that they're putting together strategies to ensure that we're measuring the actual issue. And the Prime Minister is very, very keen on saying the problem is not crime, it's a violence issue. And we've started, certainly, with the issue of corporal punishment in schools. But there's a lady here that, of course, a distinguished and honorable Jamaican, who has been studying the issue of violence, especially regarding children as well, for so many years. And she's ably leading this commission. And ladies and gentlemen, may I ask you to welcome Professor the Honorable Maureen Sams Vaughan, the chairman of the commission. Prof?
Thank you, Naomi, for that introduction. Most Honorable Andrew Holness, Prime Minister of Jamaica, Senator Peter Bunting, Leader of the Opposition, Honorable Favour Williams, Minister of Education and Youth, Mr. Wayne Robertson, Permanent Secretary, heads of diplomatic missions and international organizations, some of whom may be joining us online, ACP Desmond Brooks, representing the Commissioner of Police, Dr. Kaur Desai, consultant, commissioners, some of whom are representing agencies, heads of public agencies, other special groups and stakeholders, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen. It is my honor to stand before you today to present, on behalf of commissioners, some of the work that we have put together over the last few years. We have, of course, we started just before the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, so we were somewhat impacted by this. But we thought it was important for us to just present some of what we have been doing, and so that the country can get an idea of some of our approaches. So first, I'm going to ask you to just allow me a little time to contextualize violence, because it's important that we set it in context. I am then going to look at the public health approach to violence, and in this, I'm going to mix some of the international research, because we do have some research gaps, and so we do have to depend on some of the international work, and then to look at what is closer to us in the regional and national research. So first, my contextualization is about how the world recognized violence as a problem. So let's start. In the 1920s, you know, the first time that violence was actually measured was during a census. And that was a census in the United States, and they were only just numbering the prisoners. And somebody decided to find out what the prisoners were in there for. And then from that, the measurement of violence started. Homicide has been measured for a long time. It has been measured from the 1800s, initially from police and judicial statistics, and later when the medical profession grew, from mortality statistics. In the mid-19th century, infectious diseases fell as an important cause of death, primarily due to the discovery of antibiotics. And for the first time, violence started appearing among the top 15 causes of death in the United States and other high-income countries. Next slide. And here we see, this is just a graph to show you how long we've been measuring homicide rates, and that homicide rates have been trending downwards in high-income countries for a long time, from the 1800s. And that has to do with the development of structures and systems, and just general development of society, schools, you know, health centers. These things are still important now for violence prevention, I must say. Next. Violence became a social and health concern in 1948. The World Health Organization had defined violence as a state of health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. There's an error on that slide. In 1962, a public health specialist stated that the World Health Organization needed to do something about this, because violence does not extend life, and it does not lead to a complete state of well-being. But it was a public health problem, and it should not be the primary domain of lawyers, military personnel, and politicians. That led to research in violence in all disciplines increasing rapidly from the 1970s. Countries now started developing activities related to violence prevention, but their activities were primarily data collection and services after violence had occurred. The number of civil society organizations then started growing, and this is the importance of civil society, because civil society then made sure that when meetings were occurring, that meetings had an impact, had to present violence as a concern. So before the World Health Assembly, there were a number of international meetings that had included violence prevention: conferences on population and development, World Summit for Social Development, Fourth World Conference on Women, International Conference on Injury Prevention and Control. All of that happened before the World Health Assembly, declared violence as a public health problem. So you can see what happens when communities get together and decide that something is a social problem, and then that drives what actually happens. So I say this to our civil society organizations: keep on doing what you're doing. So the World Health Organization focused on the public health approach, and that is a preventive focus rather than a reactive focus. And it takes a look now at behavioral, social, and environmental factors and complements the reactive approaches to violence. Now, those are necessary. We need our police, we need all those, but the public health approach starts a little earlier. It's a scientific evidence-based approach, and it's a multi-sector approach. It was shown to be effective in treating disease, but it also provided services right in people's communities, and it worked with communities to solve public health problems. So the outcome of that declaration from the World Health Organization was that we all had a single definition. So I highlighted some things there. Intentional. So violence has to be intentional. You have to want to hurt someone. Force or power. Now, this was critical because sometimes in situations there's no force used, but power is used. And so it was that part of the definition was critical. The other bit that was critical was threatened or actual. You didn't actually have to hurt somebody, but if you threatened them, it was still violence. And then the other important part was resulting in or having a high likelihood. So again, you didn't actually have to injure somebody, but what you did could cause them to have a problem. And the next part of the definition was that it wasn't just injury and death. We now recognize the importance of psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation. So that definition has within it, you know, it's chock-a-block with very powerful things that were carefully included. It also ended up with us having a classification that included all forms of violence, not only those recorded by the police as crimes. So I'm just going to show you this. I'm not going to go through it, just to say that the three forms of violence are the self-inflicted, the interpersonal, and the collective violence. And you will see that the nature of violence, we have the physical, the sexual, the psychological, and the deprivation or neglect. The National Commission on Violence Prevention has not, at this point, addressed self-inflicted violence. Next slide. So let's see how we've been doing. I've set the stage for the importance of the public health approach. So let's see how we've been doing with that. So the public health approach starts off like this. Surveillance, what's the problem? You've got to define the problem through data collection. Second approach is you've got to identify the risk and protective factors, what's causing it. Once you've found out what's causing it, then you have to develop the interventions based on that evidence, and you have to find out what works and for whom. And, you know, some interventions are not going to work, and that's the importance of evaluating them. And then once you've found the ones that work, the next step is to implement them and scale up effective policy and programs. So let's see how we've been doing. So what is the problem? So, you know, we have a lot of systems in Jamaica that provide us with data. So there's the administrative data that comes from the Government of Jamaica data sources. The crime data comes from the JCF, but we also have consistent reporting of child protection data as collected by the National Children's Registry. There's a lot of other administrative data. There's a court system, you know, there's the correctional system. There's a lot of other information about crime and violence, but I'm not going to go into all of that today. The next major source of information is the Jamaica Injury Surveillance System, and this comes out of our hospitals, and I'm going to speak a little bit more about those. Then we have the periodic surveys, the National Crime Victimization Survey and the Latin America Public Opinion Survey. And so those are large household surveys. And then we have the other surveys, which are special interests, sometimes done by academia, sometimes by our international development partners, civil society, ministries, departments, and agencies, and others. They often provide information on violence categories that are not reported to the police or to hospitals, but are important. So the JCF has these 7 serious crimes, the 7 reported serious crimes, and then the 5 major or violent crimes. We're going to focus on the violent crimes. And so this is, the data that comes out of the JCF, data that we have going from, that's 2002 to 2021, and you can see that there was a period there when break-ins and robbery were among the highest peaks, and you can see the blue line there, which we've seen earlier, which is the homicide rate. Now, this graph is a graph of pure numbers, and we do know that rates are absolutely important. So the next slide shows us the one you've seen before. Mr. Vassell presented our homicide rates, which then give us an indication per population. And as he said earlier, we can see that there has been an inching up from in the 1990s and likely before. Next. When we look at the cases that are reported to the National Children's Registry, these are now child protection cases. And you can see that the child protection system started reporting on cases in 2007. And so we expected an increase in cases because the system was just evolving. So we expected that increase. And we can see that we had a peak up into 2015 to 2016. And then we started having a fall. And you can see the fall that happened in 2020. And of course, we know that that's not a fall due to a fall in cases, but that's a fall due to due to the pandemic. This, in a lot of countries, reporting increases during that period, and this is why it's so important to have your own data. But the child protection agencies all said, look, we're not seeing the kids, and this was a concern. We're actually happy to see that little uptick. Even though we don't want to know that our children have child protection problems, we actually want to know that they can get the help that they need. The Jamaica Injury Surveillance System was established, first started in 1999. I think it's got going really in 2002. It collects data from 9 of 23 public hospitals. These are all major hospitals, but it does not include the University Hospital of the West Indies. It's a subset of the patient administration system, so it's done by recording clerks initially, and it's reviewed, and it utilizes a structured World Health Organization injury surveillance system. So it collects information on accidental and unintentional injuries, violence-related injuries, suicide attempts, and motor vehicle accidents, and then that data is sent centrally to the Ministry of Health. When we look at what is collected from the injury surveillance system, it does not report on homicides, but it does report on gunshots, some of which may become homicides, but it does report on them when they enter the hospital system as gunshot wounds. And if you look at the numbers there in terms of physical assault, that number is considerably greater than what is reported to the police, because not every physical assault gets reported. And this is why it's so important for us to have different data systems so that we can get a comprehensive understanding of what violence is in our country, because unless we understand it fully, we won't be able to manage it. the Jamaica National Crime Victimization Study, it's been done over a number of years. The 2019 study was the 5th one. And what happens when we have periodic surveys like that is that we can then follow trends and see what's happening. It produces reliable estimates of victimization at the national, urban, rural areas and at parish level. A large enough sample, 4,500 participants, 16 years and older. It reports on a number of different things, and this particular one actually reported on public opinion on the CSJP, one of the flagship intervention programs. There is so much data from this, but I focus particularly on the data related to violence, but there is a tremendous amount of information available here. So again, what this is getting at now is the personal. So it gets some of our violence and aggression doesn't get to hospital. Some of it doesn't get reported, some of it doesn't get to hospital, and some of it occurs and it stays with us. And so you can see that in the past 3 years, almost 20% of the population reported physical assault and injuries. What's interesting is that this is one of the first victimization studies that's actually capturing extortion, which is one of the areas that has been, that we haven't been able to quantify as well. And I think that one of our commissioners, Professor Harriott, has been saying that this is one of the areas that needs attention in terms of our understanding it well enough. Next slide. The Latin America Public Opinion Survey in 2021 was the 9th survey. And again, it's, we can look at what is happening in trends. This had a sample size of about 3,000. And this data was collected post-COVID-19 as compared to the other data. And again, this collects a lot of data on corruption, on politics, and all that kind of thing, which is important in understanding what is happening in our population. Again, a tremendous amount of information. I focus today on intimate partner violence. And here we see the gender-based violence survey, and 2 questions. Does a man have a right to use violence? And we can see that the majority of our population either strongly disagree or disagree. But let's look at what happens below that. Domestic violence is a private matter. Okay, and how many cases of domestic violence? Well, the term has changed now to intimate partner violence, where it's violence between previous or current partners. But you can see where our problem lies. That a lot of this is not getting reported because it is considered a private matter. So this data gets to some of our cultural norms, right, that we're not going to get from the hospital data or that we're not going to get from the crime data. So survey data is actually very critical to our understanding of crime and violence. And then we have some special interest surveys, a multiple indicator cluster survey done by UNICEF, Women and Children, UN Women, Gender-Based Violence, National Birth Cohort Studies on Child Development, and the CPFSA has done a study on bullying. And I focused on the larger studies here, but there are multiple smaller surveys done by academia that also gives us an insight into what is happening in our country. So I'm just going to report on a few of these. And because the mix is done in countries across the world, we can actually be compared not only to our Caribbean neighbors, but across the world. This one here shows us in relation to our Caribbean neighbors. And this shows us the difference between boys and girls. Here it shows where we are in terms of violent discipline, even within the Caribbean. We are standing out there, even within the Caribbean, with very high rates of violent discipline. And violent discipline includes both physical discipline and emotional. It's one of the things that we're not paying enough attention to with young children is psychological violence. And you know, in the social norm study that was one of our commissioners, Commissioner Ashley, had a lot to do with, the children there were actually more concerned about psychological violence than they were about physical discipline. And we have another smaller study where university students were asked about their experiences as children in school. and they all reported on the things that were said to them in school, more so than the physical discipline. So this is another area that we have to capture and capture well so that we can address it. So birth cohort studies are important because they start with children at their birth. And so we can get information on violence against children in the very, very early years. So the first graph is children 9 to 12 months. And I want you to look at how many of our children are being shouted at, slapped, pinched, and shaken. 9 to 12 months. The other thing that's important here is, again, a culture of tolerance, because this information is not coming from the children. This information is coming from the parents who report to us exactly what they're doing. We appreciate their honesty because it tells us what we have to address. And so I've come from the crime and violence right down to in people's homes, right? So many times all we hear in the media is homicide rates, when crime and violence is a much more pervasive thing that is in our society and that needs the kind of attention. You don't need to go back to that slide, but just to show that boys already, by 9 months, we are already seeing that boys are treated different from girls. And so this is another important aspect that we have to address, the gender-based approaches to violence. When we look at intimate partner violence, another thing that's not reported as well as I showed earlier, we see that about a quarter of our women report lifetime physical or sexual violence, and economic violence, not so much economic violence, but look at emotional violence again. Emotional violence is higher than physical violence. And again, it speaks to us about how we interact with each other and the areas that we need to address. So now we come to some newer methods of data analysis. Geomapping has allowed community-level analysis of crime and violence and combines established community boundaries with social data and crime and violence data. The PIOJ has identified 830 communities. Crime and violence data has been available by communities since 2001. We analyzed the mean major crimes for the population, and we identified communities as having no major crimes below average, and major crimes at or above average. And I could never do this without the help of my good friends at the Mona Geoinformatics Institute. So I want you to look at that map. And so the green areas are communities that have had no major crimes between 2015 and 2021. The yellow are communities that have had between 1 and 29 major crimes between 2015 and 2021. So they're having crimes, but they're below the mean. And then the red areas are those that are having crimes, major crimes, above the mean. So you can see the mapping of our country, but because we have social data, we are actually able to look a little more closely. So I'm presenting to you just some preliminary information. Next slide, please. So, of those communities, you can see that 410, or almost 50% of communities in the country, have had no major crimes. That's huge. We go about from day to day, and we think that every corner of this country, because we get bombarded with it, and we think that every corner of the country is having these major crimes. However, I also want to point out to you that in those communities that have no crimes, only 22% of the population live. So more than 2/3, we're talking about nearly 80% of our population lives in communities where there is trauma. All right, that's important. 80% of our population is living in a community where there is trauma. And when you look at those communities, who are those communities? Who is living in them? So the majority of the communities that have zero crimes are our deep rural communities. We have a lot to learn from them. But if you look at poverty, you will see that as it's commonly associated with deep rural communities, they have the highest proportion of poverty. And they also, those communities and the communities with low levels have also lower levels of mean unemployment. Next slide. So I've presented just a snippet of the data that we have that has to be gone through. Much is available on incidence and prevalence. Combining the data and using geomapping analysis holds promise for us to be able to focus our interventions very well, and we'll come to this in a minute. But you know, we have variations in definitions across data collection systems. We do have some data gaps. I mentioned extortion, child abuse. We really have primarily reported data. This is not unique to Jamaica. This happens all over. Child abuse is data that's difficult to get, except retrospectively. Some of the data is not current, so we have these periodic surveys, and some of the data is not collected consistently. This data is not available in any one place. There is no central source of data. And the data, therefore, is not being analyzed in an integrated way. The other thing is that because there's no central source of data, and because this analysis is not being done in the way it should be, the data is not easily available to policymakers, to program implementers, and even to community members, you know, who might want to know whether, how's my community doing? And the other thing is that public reporting focuses us tremendously on homicide statistics, and there's less focus on other exposures to violence, which are important. And, you know, when we get to the point of homicide, we have failed. We have failed all along the way, right? And so it's so important for us to look back. And that's what prevention is all about, looking back and trying to stem the tide. So let's look at how we're doing in terms of the second, identifying risk and protective factors. Next slide. Unlike incidence and prevalence data, there are fewer local and regional studies that are focused on identifying risk factors for violence. Even fewer identify protective factors. The few studies that exist, however, are consistent with that in the international literature. Risk and protective factor research tends to focus on children and youth, primarily, as research has shown clearly, that though perpetrators of crimes, perpetrators and indeed victims, are primarily in the 16 to 34 age group, the risk factors were imprinted a whole lot earlier than that, and that's the importance of prevention science. So I've selected a few studies, and the importance of looking at these studies is to see how consistent the risk factors are. So years ago, Mr. Farrington started a study where he took some 8-year-old boys and he followed 400 of them, and he followed them for 50 years. And looked at criminality, and the study was eventually published in 2006. So this was a single study with a very small sample size, which was consistent with the time period. And he identified these 6 factors that he said were associated with criminality: disrupted family, a family member that had a conviction, a child who was very impulsive, a child who was not doing well at school, and there were some socioeconomic factors such as poor housing and family size. And all of these were identified in children of 8 years. Back up for me, please, thank you. By 2008 now, we had a meta-analysis now, because there are so many more studies like this. And the meta-analysis confirmed a lot of what had been done in that single study, that there was exposure to violence, family structure was important, family function was important, but it was a different type of family functioning. It was parenting, and the extremes of parenting, the lack of supervision and the authoritarianism. The extremes of parenting were what was causing a problem. And then child behavior, hyperactivity, aggression, conduct disorders, depression were also important. Fast forward now to the 2000s. We're all talking about ACEs, but that information was there a long time ago. The ACEs have been publicized very well, and it's easier to publicize them now because of social media. Poor Mr. Farrington, I mean, you got to go and find his journal in a hard copy to go and read it, right? Now we know about ACEs all over social media. But pretty much the same. A lot of exposure to violence, parental separation and discord, and what was coming up, the convicted family member still stayed. What was coming up now was mental illness. It was still family function, but it was related to mental illness and substance abuse. We have 2 studies that were done in the Caribbean. You see, those 3 earlier studies were all about adults and looking back to childhood. We have 2 studies in the Caribbean, one in the Caribbean, one in Jamaica. And the Caribbean study included Jamaicans. And it was the Caribbean Adolescent Survey that was done in 2000. And again, exposure to violence was important. Parental separation was not a consideration, probably because of our social structures in the Caribbean. But mental health, substance use, and a family member who had committed suicide. And because these were adolescents, no, it wasn't hyperactivity and aggression, no. It was rage. It was described as rage, just anger, and truancy. And a lot of kids are truant because school doesn't meet their needs. That's often why they're truant. And then we looked at 12-year-olds in Jamaica. So the first 3 studies were looking at adults and looking back when they were children. We were now looking at kids who were aggressive. And again, exposure to violence, child shifting, family functioning, child behavior, drug use, suicidal thoughts, and low attainment. So if you look across those, you'll see the impact of exposure to violence on long-term violence in society. You will also see the impact of the functioning of families in the different ways that families function, in mental health, parenting. And then, if you look at child behavior, you'll see that children tell us when things are not going wrong, and we need to respond to what they're telling us. We don't need to hit them or hurt them. We need to find them the support that they need. So we have clues from child behavior. So based on all of this and the information that we have, I present now how violence plays out in children's daily lives. So let's follow a child. Before children leave home in the morning, they observe adult behavior in the home. 2 out of 3 see and hear verbal abuse. 1 out of 3 see adults throwing objects and hitting each other. And I need to say these are 12-year-old children in urban Jamaica. 1 out of 5 see adults kick, beat each other, threaten, or use a gun or knife. And so here comes the prevention arm, dispute resolution, addressing gender-based violence, intimate partner violence, and family violence. But before our kids leave home, they also have personal experiences of violence. 8 out of 10 get verbal aggression. 8 out of 10 get hit. So the prevention aspect here is parenting support, including mental health, and legislation to ban corporal punishment. But all of these, and I put that at the bottom because all of this has to be based on public education that brings everybody together as to why we need to do these things, to discuss our harmful cultural norms, to discuss the impact of violence on children, and to discuss specific prevention mechanisms. And of course, public education is very different today. It's not just about writing something in a newspaper. Of course, there's social media, there's Instagram, there's everything. While they're walking in their communities, most children see fighting, stoning, police arresting others, see a dead body, see someone stabbed, see someone being robbed, see someone being shot. And 1 out of 100 children reported that they were shot at. So the prevention here that's jumping out is community dispute resolution, community policing, and you know, one of those studies, surveys that were done said that persons in their community trusted the police in their community more than they trusted the rest of the police force. So here is a key, community policing. And of course, gang violence interruption, because a lot of what we see, as we're going to see later, is gang violence. At school, among their peers, 3 out of 10 get beaten up. 2 out of 10 get stoned and robbed. 1 out of every 10 gets stabbed. And stabbing is a cultural problem. It starts in school, and it starts with pencils, and then when you get the geometry set, yeah? So when you're seeing stabbing as a concern all the way up there, it starts all the way down. So the prevention aspects here are peer conflict resolution. At school in the classroom, 5 out of 10 receive verbal aggression. 7 out of 10 are hit. And one of the main reasons that, and this is children reporting, one of the main reasons that children report they're hit is because they're not able to learn. When children can't learn, there is a problem. And we need to fix the problem, not hit children. So the prevention here is teacher education and support, and again, legislation to ban corporal punishment. When they return to their communities, 4 out of 100 will watch the sexual assault of someone. 2 out of 100 will be victims of sexual assault. So here we have children who are being nullified to the impact of gender-based violence. So our prevention mechanisms here would be parenting support for child protection, child education on child protection, and again, legislative support. And the endpoint. When they lie in their beds at night, 4 out of 10 children will cry for the family member or the family friend that had been lost to murder. 1 out of 40 will have lost a father to murder. And here now is where we are trying to catch the eight ball now, because the intervention that we're doing here now is no longer primary. We're into secondary and tertiary intervention, which is much more expensive, requires much more intervention, and it's not, I have counseling there, but really and counseling is what the majority of our children get, but what has been really shown to work for trauma is cognitive behavior therapy. Do we have a lot of cognitive behavior therapists here? No, we don't. So we can't afford to be going to that end. We've got to work way below here. While I do think we need to ensure that we put in place the systems to advance more of that kind of support. Next. And so what happens to our children after that? So on the left, we have the slide of a healthy brain, and on the right, we have the slide of an abused brain. And I want you to notice the gaps that are there. And those gaps are in 2 main areas. They're in the areas of emotion, and they're in the areas of cognition. We have other research that shows that the impact of violence on children is their limited ability to learn, and they're going into behavior problems. And this is why. Next. But that was huge stuff. That was severe abuse. What we have learned in the last year or so is that even milder violence is now impacting brain structure. You see, years back, we didn't have pictures like this. We didn't have the capacity to see what was actually happening to children. And what is happening here? This is a study on spanking, which I'm just using as one of the forms of milder violence. The prefrontal cortex, which is here, is 1/10 of your brain. And what it does is it organizes for you. It plans. It's your memory. It's your attention. It's what regulates your emotion. And that is what is being reduced by 15 to 20% for adults who have been exposed to corporal punishment. Next slide. So what it does also, the emotional regulation is impacted, and social information processing is impacted. So what happens is that a child who has these brain changes interprets everything around them as being fearful and responds to that fear. And so all their brain power is dedicated to processing fear. And so they sit in class, but they can't think and they can't learn. And so here we have the pyramid that starts off with our social conditions, moves through to the ACEs, disrupts the neurodevelopment that I just showed you, leads to social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, and then we get up the pyramid to social problems, and then we get on to an early death. So what can we do about this? Now that we know all these risk factors, do we have anything to suggest that there are protective factors? Yes, we do. So the two key protective factors are high-quality early childhood development. You know I couldn't be up here and not mention early childhood. And parenting support. Next slide. And so, you know, a lot of us quote this Perry preschool study, and we talk about how great early childhood development is for advancing children's education. But we forget, until we look at this slide, that the greatest impact of high-quality early childhood development is crime reduction. See all that blue bar there? That's crime reduction. The education bit is that yellow bit. But the education also leads to higher learning, which is that green bit. Next slide. And so the kids in the Perry preschool study at 40 years, much fewer of them had been arrested, much fewer of them had been arrested for violent crime, and much fewer of them had had drug crimes. Next. But we don't actually have to go as far as the US because we have our own studies here. So the Caribbean Institute for Health Research enrolled children at age 9 to 24 months many, many years ago in a stimulation and nutritional supplementation program. At the time, it was all about kids' nutrition, but they followed the kids later on, and they found the same things that the Perry preschool study found. They found the kids had better development. They found the kids' IQs were better. They were more likely to be in good jobs, and they followed them for a long time. And at 22 years, more of these kids were in tertiary education. They had better mental health, and they were also less likely to be involved in violent behavior. So we don't have to go that far. We have our own work. It's a small study, it's a small sample size, but it is ours, and it is a very high-quality study. In terms of protective factors, the other protective factors for older children are connectedness from the Caribbean Adolescent Health Survey, engagement in extracurricular activities from the Jamaican Birth Cohort Study, life skills training and positive parenting support from the Child Resiliency Program. I also want to mention, and here I'm taking some of Professor Harriot's slides from a publication that he did, just to show that we, you know, while we are working at these early prevention mechanisms, we also have to do something about this. Because gang interruption, if we look at our homicide rate, we will see that a lot of this is related to gang violence. And we can't get away from the homicide rate. It is a concern. So we have to address gang violence. So some of those early things are going to prevent kids going into gang violence. And our own commissioner, Dr. Herbert Gale, has said a lot about the impact of violence, especially in young boys, leading to them getting into these kinds of behaviors. Next slide. So we're on to the last bit, developing and evaluating interventions. What works and for whom? Well, there has been some research internationally, and the preventive things that work, I've mentioned them before, support for parents through home visiting, parent support, but these have been calculated to reduce offending. So parent support training reduces offending by 31%, a preschool program reduces offending by 35%, mentoring of young males reduces offending by 50 to 65%, school life skills programs reduce offending by 50 to 52%. I already mentioned cognitive behavioral training. Look at that impact. It's 80%, but it's not a primary prevention method. And parental multisystemic therapy, which involves supporting parents everywhere that they need support, does 63%. So those more intensive things are going to give you the greater impact, but those are going to be for a small sector of the society, whereas the preventive things have to be for a much larger population. And of course, there's law enforcement, hotspot policing, and drug courts. We also know what doesn't work. Boot camps for children, intensive supervision, harsh correctional treatments, and we also know what is downright damaging, scaring kids. Doesn't work. And having excessive juvenile convictions doesn't work. Next slide. So we then mapped our interventions on our major crimes by community. And this is very, very early work. We're not finished with this yet. Next slide. So we have 696 individual interventions that were done across communities in 2015 to 2021, and Dr. Cordesai is coming right after me to talk about interventions, the interventions that were done. We counted the individual interventions. So if a program had 20 different communities, it was counted 20 times because we were looking at the community level. Of 830 communities, 144, or 17.3%, had at least one intervention. There were 517 interventions in those 144 communities, an average of 3.6 per community, and they were of different types. Communities with no major crimes had a total of 94 interventions, accounting for 13.5% of all interventions. This is just an aside that we have some information on the public perception of the effectiveness of intervention programs, and this was because a special module was done in the National Crime Victimization Survey, and you can see that the public perception of intervention, which is important, is the greatest effectiveness was considered to be the Child Diversion Program, Integrated Community Development Program, and the CSJP. But the others are still, they're still pretty high in terms of public perception of effectiveness. Next slide. So our work continues. Prime Minister, it's a lot of work. Our work continues. We have a number of reports that are in progress. And next slide. Our next steps, we have so much that the commissioners decided that we will need to have a symposium to present the evidence, and we will receive consultations at that point. And of course, the end point that I have to present to the Prime Minister on behalf of commissioners is the 10-year strategic plan. But you can see the elements that are emerging. Next slide. So I want to thank all our local and international development partners. They have funded studies, they have funded program interventions, they've provided technical support. So a lot of these studies that I'm reporting on, they would have funded in some way. I particularly want to mention the IDB and the FCDO, which has worked very closely with the Ncvp since its inception. I want to also thank Mona Geoinformatics, because without them, I could not have done the kind of analysis by community. And I also want to thank the previous and current members of the technical team at the Ncvp. Some of the previous members are here, and I'm really happy that they are. And I also want to thank the Jamaica House Fellows who have contributed so much, particularly to the economic analysis and to the legal analysis. Thank you all for listening.
Wow, Prof, that's a lot of work. And for those in our viewing public and all of Jamaica who continue to say, boy, why we can't find the solution quick? It's been generations. And, you know, Prof, you said that children actually are exposed to violence early, even before they leave home. A lot of the times, even before they wake up, when you live in a household and you're waking up late and they're waking you up, pop, 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 wake up! That is tough. I mean, I sat there and I was just amazed at really and truly how much of a serious generational problem this is to get solutions to. So I would say to the Commission, take time, hurry up. Yes, Jamaicans are really, really impatient to get to some solutions. But I would also say to Jamaica, this is a massive issue that we must address. It's not just the end result of it, which is the crime we see, but this issue of violence is so very, very critical, pervasive, and we have to solve that to solve the other matters. Ladies and gentlemen, I know it's been a lot, but we have more because it's a very important commission that we have. And thank you so much for those who are here with us and for those who continue to join us online. May I then now invite Dr. Charlene Cordesai, very, very insightful researcher and individual too. She's done a lot of work. I know her personally. And I think that she really does understand the kind of research that is involved in this. May I just, from a matter of housekeeping perspective, the great thing about being the moderator is that I already set the stage for the protocols, so there really is no need to come back and say, you know, under the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition's representative, and then we can go into certainly all of the research that we need to talk about. So, Dr. Desai.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. The Most Honorable Andrew Holness, Prime Minister of Jamaica, Senator Peter Bunting, representing the leader of the opposition, all protocols observed, as Madam Chair has said. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here to present this work that we have done for the National Commission on Violence Prevention. I want to acknowledge my co-researcher, who is Professor Nancy Guerra from the University of California. She couldn't be with us today, not here in person, which she would love. She loves Jamaica. She has done a lot of work in Jamaica over the years, but she can't join us online either. But I really do want to acknowledge her. She did a tremendous amount of work on this, and she's an expert on violence prevention in our region, in Latin America and the Caribbean. Also, it's always difficult to speak after Professor Samson. What a wonderful presentation, Prof. But I'm going to try. And today I'm going to be talking about the research and situation analysis that we did for the Commission on Violence Prevention. And we specifically focused on interventions. So next slide, please. Okay, what was our objective in this research? So the Commission really asked us to look at charting an evidence-based approach to violence prevention in order to help define and manage violence prevention in terms of what do we need to move forward. And there are really two goals here. We wanted to understand why serious rates of crime and violence in Jamaica have remained stable, relatively stable, as we've seen from all of the previous presentations. And it's also quite high for the region, right? In spite of the numerous prevention and reduction programs that we have implemented over the years. But also we want to determine a clear path forward to effect meaningful and substantial change. So how did we go about doing this? The first thing is we wanted to review, I'm so sorry, I don't wonder if these glasses are working. I'm going to be looking at my paper a lot, everyone. Please excuse me. It's hard to see the slides from here. So we wanted to review and synthesize the key literature on violence prevention, not only in Jamaica, but also regionally and internationally. So we did this by conducting a systematic review of documents and reports of programs aimed at reducing violence, including but not limited to the reduction of antisocial behavior in children and juveniles, intimate partner violence, prisoner reoffending, community social norms justifying violence, as Prof has highlighted several of these. And we really wanted to focus, and we were asked by the Commission to focus on a specific time period, which was the last 5 years, right? And we started this work in 2020. We also conducted interviews with many of you in this room and online, I'm sure. So we looked at talking to key stakeholders responsible for coordinating governmental and non-governmental work on violence prevention in Jamaica, including our international organizations who are helping to support a lot of this work. We were asked to create a database with key information on projects implemented between 2015 and 2020, aimed at reducing or preventing violence, and then to identify current trends in violence prevention in Jamaica for the reduction of violence, considering best practices at the international level, as well as the regulations and recommendations issued by specialized international organizations on this matter. So this is what we did. And we had to have some criteria. As you can imagine, there's so much out there on this. So many things could be considered violence prevention. Prof looked at, you know, things that are happening in early childhood. And so we really had to decide what can we manage to look at in a reasonable time frame. So strategies aimed at violence prevention include a wide variety of approaches, such as creating better schools, increasing levels of employment, improving public spaces. But given the focus of this research, all of the interventions and strategies that may contribute to violence prevention could not be included, as I mentioned. So we specifically looked at programs that had identifiable target beneficiaries or had specific violence or violence-related outcomes. These included parenting and early childhood interventions. We couldn't leave it out, right, Prof? After school and youth engagement, vocational and job training initiatives, and community safety and justice programs. However, we were not able to look at things like public education campaigns, conditional cash transfers, law enforcement reform, and we know Prof. Harriet has done a lot of work on that, and legislation. We just couldn't manage it in this particular scope of this particular research. So programs were only included if they targeted individuals 0 to 29 and were delivered in the last 5 years. So we focused on the most salient risk and protective factors and context linked with intervention, implementation, and service delivery for these 3 distinct age groups that you see on the slide. So for 0 to 7, we really focused on family-based interventions, such as home visitation programs to improve parenting skills and family functioning. For the childhood period, we looked at school-based and after-school programs that included things like remedial education, teacher training, school climate improvement, and after-school programs to build resiliency. And for the youth category, we focused on vocational skills and employment-based programs for out-of-school and or incarcerated youth. Next slide. So, in terms of the method, we requested reports and evaluations from relevant organizations. We also reviewed archival data from multilaterals under their program evaluation links on their websites. We also conducted a general literature research of relevant databases, and through this we were able to compile 120 documents to review. And they were organized by jurisdiction, so local, regional, or international, and by prevention level. As we said, we've been using a kind of public health model, so we looked at primary prevention, tertiary, and secondary prevention programs. And then we also made an attempt to organize programs by type, so whether it was parenting, child resilience, youth development, etc. We also conducted an initial online survey of stakeholders here in Jamaica, requesting any reports or information. We contacted about 104 government and non-government organizations to request information on their violence prevention activities in the last 5 years. And we also conducted key informant interviews and focus groups with some various stakeholders. And there were a wide range of people that we tried to talk to and organizations that we tried to talk to. So this is what we found. Next slide. Okay, 4 key themes emerged from the looking at the local, regional, and international research. And these 4 themes were linked to why serious violence has not declined significantly in Jamaica. And we used it to guide our review of current and recent programs and to make suggested next steps. The first theme was that violence is a multiply determined behavior caused by a confluence of individual and contextual risk factors that unfolds over time and vary across individuals. I don't need to go into this too much. Prof did an excellent job of setting the stage. But essentially, it means that prevention and intervention must approach solutions from a holistic perspective that considers how individual risk unfolds over time and across contexts. This requires an understanding of, first of all, how these individual, contextual, and societal risk and protective factors are interconnected, which is why the data and the research is so important, and the mapping and looking at individuals and what risks they're exposed to. But also that the variation in patterns of risk across individuals, so even individuals from similar backgrounds, from similar communities, are not going to always have all of the same risks. Right? And so some of the interventions may work well with some people but not others, because maybe we need to be taking a closer look at what are some of those issues for that individual. Also, how risk unfolds over time. So, sorry, not yet. Right, thanks. Also, how risk unfolds over time. So we look at early childhood, to middle childhood to adolescence, there are going to be different risk factors at play. And so we need to maybe take a lifespan approach as well. And then also all of this has implications for necessary versus sufficient programmatic responses. And so programs simply may be necessary but not sufficient if they do not target the critical individual and contextual risk factors across development. So something may be necessary, you know, to work in the sense that maybe we need skills training, right? We need skills training. But skills training on its own is not going to be sufficient if there are not opportunities for us to assist young people in getting gainful employment and so forth. So we have to also think about those issues as well. Next slide. The second key theme that emerged, and it will not be a surprise to anyone here, is that programs and policies must be coordinated and integrated at the local, regional, national, and transnational level in Jamaica. So a central theme was a lack of coordination among violence prevention actors in Jamaica. And an analogy that we use in the report is that if you think about it visually like building a house, imagine that you have a list of tradespeople and you have several different people randomly pick the trades that are going to build your house. And you also make it possible for people to pick more than one trade. What might happen? You might, and you don't hire a general contractor, right? So there's no one coordinating this building process. You may end up with 3 plumbers, no electrician. The roofers may come before you're putting up the walls. And at the end of the day, you can't live in this house, right? And there's no clear blueprint for what you need to complete this project. And this is how we can sort of see the state of violence prevention in Jamaica as it currently stands. Because many people that we spoke to and many of the reports that we looked at reiterated that one of the main challenges that we have is this lack of coordination. It's a major obstacle to violence prevention in Jamaica, right? We need someone to oversee everything that's going on, because this lack of coordination can take many forms. So we have, and many people complained about all of us working in silos, for example, not sharing information on successes and failures, and not pooling, most importantly, I think, not pooling and sharing scarce resources. And so there really needs to be this overarching coordination. It really came very strongly from everybody that we talked to and all the research that we consulted. Next slide. Okay. It has been said before, but a lot of the serious violence that we have, I mean, violence is a general problem in Jamaica, but a lot of the serious violence is driven by a small subset of the population. So efforts to reduce violence in the short term must target the highest risk offenders in the highest risk communities, while also establishing long-term strategies for prevention. So in Jamaica and worldwide, we know that violence rates are largely driven by males in the 18 to 35 category with poor academic and employment skills. We already know that many of these young people live in communities with high levels of violence, fueled by gang activity, easy access to weapons. I mean, we know a lot of the challenges. And the data clearly indicates that any effort to bring about any immediate reduction in serious violence has to begin with targeting these groups. However, we also need to stem the tide, as Professor Tamswan was saying in her presentation, and it came out very strongly in what she's saying. We have to deal with the current generation of high-impact offenders through tertiary prevention and crime control strategies, but we cannot ignore it's imperative that we simultaneously prevent the next generation from developing through focused and integrated prevention efforts. And that is where the primary and secondary prevention programming comes in. Next slide. Okay, this is also coming out very strongly in Professor Samswan's presentation and in others, that we have to clearly articulate barriers to program implementation and set realistic expectations that build on the available evidence-based and enhance local capacity. One of the wonderful things about the National Commission on Violence Prevention is that it is data-driven, it is evidence-based. It wants to really ensure that we're implementing, we have a strategy and that we're implementing programs and interventions that really take into account what we know and what works, right? And we can't do that until we get a better handle on monitoring and evaluation in Jamaica and learn from this. And this is not only a Jamaican problem. In fact, when we looked at the research, the lack of comprehensive evaluations in Jamaica is not unique. In a study of over 1,300 discrete security and violence prevention programs in Latin America and the Caribbean, less than 7% had any type of experimental or quasi-experimental or even general impact evaluation. So the reality on the ground is that this is an issue, but it is extremely important, and we have to find a way through it. So, you know, a lot of it has to do with that. It's very difficult for many of our organizations, whether it be technical expertise or resources, it's very difficult to really do the type of impact evaluations that are going to show us some of the things that we would like to see or be sure of. So we have to, I think, find alternatives, but we know, and it's a clear consensus from all the key informants, all the reports that we looked at, everyone we talked to spoke about the fact that monitoring, evaluation, and learning from youth prevention programs needs some strengthening, and that it's extremely important. So one of the strategies that we used in this particular research is to establish a set of guidelines for program targets and strategies based on the regional and international evidence gathered through other experimental studies on risk factors for violence. And what were some of the key programs, the key components that were effective for those programs. And then it's possible to review, right, our programs through the lens of those components to see if our programs also had those components which are effective. Next slide. So this is what we actually found from our inventory. So what I was just presenting had to do with themes emerging from our focus groups, from the literature, and just also from talking with other stakeholders. But I want to stop a minute now and tell you a little bit about what we found in our inventory of violence prevention programs in Jamaica. So as I mentioned before, we contacted about 104 organizations to request information on their violence prevention activities. And these were from a wide variety of sectors to ensure coverage and inclusion of the different types of violence prevention programs that exist in Jamaica. Through various methods, we received information from 43 organizations. Some of them said that they weren't currently offering violence prevention programs, for example, or some of them were merely supporting other organizations to do these programs. So we ended up with 45 violence prevention programs to include in the inventory. And of that number, 25 were focused on primary and secondary prevention. And then 20 were focused on tertiary prevention and crime control. And there may have been some, like the comprehensive CSJP, which would have had a number of strategies in one intervention. These programs were administered by 19 organizations, including ministries, departments, and agencies, NGOs, CSOs, and academic institutions. And the programs range from large multi-component interventions delivered over many years to much smaller community-based, school-based initiatives. Next slide. Most of the programs targeted at-risk youth in hotspot areas, and this is not a surprise to us either. This has been the strategy. So Kingston and St. Andrew, St. Catherine, St. James, and Clarendon. Most of the programs were funded by, that made it into the inventory, were funded by IDPs. Of the 45 programs reviewed for the final inventory, only 25 reported having any kind of evaluation, and less than 30% were impact evaluations or looked at the effectiveness of the program. So others were more process-oriented, monitoring, did we implement it correctly, and those types of things. It's also important to note that several organizations could only provide information on process outcomes, and that there's very, very little data on the impact, as I was saying. Next slide. So let us look at the actual programs in terms of the different categories: tertiary, secondary, and primary prevention. So we actually begin our inventory on the flip side. So we begin with reviewing programs in Jamaica over the past 5 years that targets those most at risk and likely to commit serious crime. And within the public health framework that we heard about as, one of the organizing frameworks for the National Commission on Violence Prevention, this translates to developing programs and strategies in the most impacted communities and among those most at risk, based on prior violent and criminal behavior. And so we found 3 different types of categories of programs under this. So we have community development programs, reform of justice and correctional systems for youth and young adults, and anti-gang interventions. So in terms of community development programs, we know that Jamaica has a long history of initiating community development programs. In the current review, since 2015, we identified 5 of these focused on community development to enhance the rule of law, including things like CSJP3 and the JCIF Integrated Community Development Projects. The impact evaluations of these programs yielded mixed results, and in general, the individual level change was more successful than the community level change. So there were really some very strong positive results from the studies, but many of these were at the individual level. And so we want to find ways that we can translate what's happening at the individual level to the community level, to a broader level. In terms of reform of justice and correctional systems for youth, we found 6 programs. One of the main programs that came out of this is the diversion programs. And diversion has really been found, on balance, has been found to reduce recidivism at a greater rate than traditional justice and correctional processing. For example, a 2013 meta-analysis of 73 programs with research evidence, diversion programs were found to be more effective in reducing recidivism than judicial interventions across different risk levels and for different types of programs. And I'm happy to report that we have a national child diversion program here in Jamaica that is a wonderful program, working really well, and we just really need to encourage, the police, the judiciary, everybody, the communities to really embrace. I think it's really helping a lot of young people. Of course, we also have our Mediation and Restorative Justice Dispute Resolution Foundation, and also some rehabilitation work that we really want to see in our correctional facilities. We need to put a little bit more into some of the rehabilitation that's happening there. In terms of the anti-gang interventions, Prof mentioned violence interruption and other work that's done in the community in terms of gang demobilization, and we found 2 interventions there. Again, there have been mixed results as it relates to these types of interventions. I think that there's some really great work there, and we have to look into what works well and why in some communities and not in others. Next slide. Okay, in terms of the primary and secondary programs to prevent violence, while the most immediate response to crime and violence is to intervene with youth and the young adult offenders, we also want to simultaneously prevent violence from occurring through these primary and secondary prevention programs. The primary programs are going to focus on, as Prof said, a more universal group. They're typically broad, population-based, to promote healthy development and well-being, particularly within populations that are at greater risk. Most primary efforts target children during the preschool and primary school years. And then we have the secondary programs, which emphasize identifying youth who are most likely to engage in crime and violence based on well-established risk factors, and then intervening specifically with these youth, usually adolescents and young adults. But we also do a lot of work in Jamaica with after-school programs and things for the school-age children. So next slide. Professor Sams Vaughan mentioned that there is considerable empirical support, both internationally and in Jamaica. We don't have to look too far. We have a lot of wonderful work in Jamaica on this, for the effectiveness of early childhood parenting and preschool educational programs in preventing childhood aggression and child maltreatment. Recent research also suggests that these programs prevent violence later in life, which of course is what we're trying to do, right? Consistent with evidence that early aggression and maltreatment are strong predictors of later violence. So, for example, in a meta-analysis of 73 early parenting programs, researchers found a significant positive effect of early parent training on preventing later violence and delinquency. So these programs are extremely important for getting in early and helping parents help their children have the best outcomes. So we found 3 parenting programs in our inventory, when we looked at what was happening out there. And we found that many of these programs had strong evidence base. Now, these were some of the programs that had the RCTs and the real impact evaluations that we'd want to see. Really done some stringent research work. And this is from our team at CARE as well. So this is Reach Up and Learn and Irie Homes. And these parenting programs, they've done a lot of research to see how it has impacted the children and the families. In terms of preschool programs, we found one, which was Irie Classroom, again from our team at CARE. And the results of the research that they have done on this have showed improvements in class-wide pro-social behavior, classroom environments, and teachers' use of violence against students, which Prof has highlighted can be very damaging, including verbal abuse and intimidation. Remember, that is what they remembered. They remembered what was happening to them in the university students that were interviewed. That's what stood out to them, you know. So it does have a strong impact on children. This program has been adopted by the Early Childhood Commission, and I think they're in the process now of seeing how it can be scaled up. Next slide. Continuing in this work on school-age children and youth, looking at some of the programs there are 3 categories again here. So there are programs to promote social and emotional learning. There are programs to prevent dropout, or what we call having an alternative school, and also the multi-component programs, which were, out of all programs in our inventory, those were the most programs, right? So in terms of social and emotional learning, there was one program that we identified, and this was the Health and Family Life Education skills-based curriculum from the Ministry of Education. And in recent years, there have been many large-scale and systematic efforts to integrate social and emotional learning, also called social literacy, into schools and community settings. Again, this is about changing our social norms and how we see things. So the Health and Family Life Education is a comprehensive approach to developing and maintaining positive attitudes towards health and well-being in children and young people. The program is delivered through the public school system, as we know, early childhood to grade 9, and it seeks to promote the development of healthy knowledge, social and emotional competencies and behaviors. And they've recently added some modules specifically related to safety and security. In terms of the dropout and prevention programs, we found 4. And these programs were related to academic enrichment in high schools and communities. Several of them provided remedial education, vocational training, mentorship, and educational support for unattached or youth at risk. But as I mentioned, the programs that were really coming out most strongly in the inventory were the multi-component programs. And these are programs that include multiple components, okay? So this is typically targeting youth at risk in late childhood and adolescence, and it includes comprehensive school programs, extracurricular programs such as sports, music, multipurpose community centers, resilience building programs, mental health and therapeutic programs, and behavioral interventions, okay? And there are some examples there. Next slide. We also had in this category vocational training programs. Because of the link between unemployment and delinquency, a number of programs have been developed in the region and internationally focused on vocational training and workforce preparation. And there are some examples there of HOPE, CSJP3, Vocational Skills Training Program, and private sector mentorship programs that can fall into this category. Also, family functioning and parenting skills, very important. Prof highlighted this in her work at family functioning being a huge risk factor, and parenting skills being protective. And so there were some examples here on parenting programs that were specifically focused on prevention, on violence prevention. Next slide. So in terms of the recommendations, we have organized them under the themes. So under the first theme, which is looking at all the risk factors that come together and protective factors, we looked at 3 main recommendations. First, to reduce young children's exposure to violence and harsh discipline through targeted evidence-based programs for parents and teachers and national campaigns to shift cultural norms, especially as it relates to harsh punishment. Invest resources in improving the ability of the Jamaican public school system to address the social, emotional, and academic needs of primary school children. And develop a coordinated and integrated island-wide effort to train young people in high-demand fields and place them in long-term living wage positions. Next slide. We also called for the establishment of a national body to oversee a cohesive approach to preventing violence in Jamaica, focused on prevention of serious violence, led by a senior staff with significant expertise in the field. And we see this coordinating body as something that can establish and maintain a central registry for sharing and aligning programs, as well as coordinating between the government, local communities, NGOs, IDPs, everybody, on developing plans and priorities with local conditions and helping to roll out and implement these. Next slide. Under the third theme, we want to recommend building integrated and coordinated prevention and intervention systems targeting the highest risk young people in hotspot communities, and also enacting comprehensive prison reform, emphasizing rehabilitation and the reintegration of offenders. Next slide. And finally, we really want to establish a Jamaican Crime Lab. Maybe this can be under the same coordinating body, led by a senior researcher to oversee, coordinate, facilitate, and provide training and technical assistance for all IDP and government-funded violence prevention activities. And we really feel that such an evaluation, such a lab can help to promote a culture of evaluation and data-driven decision-making for crime and violence prevention, and help with the definitions, as well as making sure we're all using the same definitions, and really support the monitoring and evaluation work that we hope will be strengthened in the country. Next slide. Of course, there are some limitations. Prof mentioned that the Commission got off just as COVID started, so that I think impacted our ability to move as freely as we wanted to. And so, of course, some organizations weren't able to respond in a timely manner, and this led to their exclusion from the inventory. So we still want to ensure that we're covering all of these, so we continue to invite people to share their work with the Commission so that we can know exactly what's happening in all these various communities as it relates to violence prevention. Next slide. Especially wanted to thank the IDB for their generous support of this situation analysis, and the contribution of all the key informants and participants who took the time to meet with us, discuss, and to give us information on this, and also to our research assistants. And then also, thank you to all of you for your kind attention. Thank you.
Doc, thanks a million. We realize the tremendous work that you have put in dealing with the situation analysis, and we expect certainly as time goes on that we'd get far more from it. Now the man who is tasked to ensure, and the people of Jamaica have tasked him really, to ensure that we do have this blueprint and the coordination happens is the Prime Minister, the Most Honourable Andrew Holness. Certainly he has presented the policy framework and has set up the commission. So let's hear from the Prime Minister in terms of what will happen next. And I would just say that even ahead of him coming, change takes time. Prime Minister.
Thank you, Madam Master of Ceremony. Thanks to everyone who has remained very attentive through the program, including those on social media. Sometimes when we are in the moment, we don't realize the significance of it. It is only after a period of analysis and historians analyze and place things into context that we say, oh, that's what they were doing. It's very difficult to see the future from the present. That's the main takeaway that I have found in trying to treat with some of our existential threats that we have. Just trying to get the society to appreciate the threat, appreciate the strategies that are being employed, and how these strategies being employed now will change the future. So we do have to take time to explain. And I want to thank Professor Sams Vaughan for, one, taking up this task of heading the commission. I know you have a lot of other things to do, Prof. And I literally insisted upon you taking it. I've worked with you for many years whilst I was in the Ministry of Education, so I know your capacity and your passion as well for the subject. And I know the academic rigor that you bring to this. And indeed, all the other members of the commission who are here, I want to thank you personally for taking up the challenge. It is a significant challenge. And I just wanted to point out to the listening public that if you notice the detail that the presenters have gone through. So this is not a commission that is just dealing with things on a surface level. They are delving into the real content and giving us the information. And Prof, may I congratulate you on the national honor that I had just a little bit to do with. But even so, I mean, you are obviously very deserving of the honor. The establishment of the National Commission on Violence Prevention marks the definitive intention of the government to address violence in our country. Every Jamaican feels the effect of violence. But after generations of violence and the socialization of violence and the reinforcement of violence in our culture, in our entertainment, in our schools, in our media, violence has become normalized. We just see it as an everyday part of life. Now, once the issue of concern is normalized, the society accepts it. Every generation comes, they accept it. Even if they all agree that it has a negative impact, we still accept the use of it. You know, look, if children get into a fight at school and one child goes home and complains to the parent, what is the parent likely to do? There are several things, Peter, that comes from that. One, the parent could say, you lick him back? Come, we'll go down to school. They end up at school, they get into an argument with the teacher. Or they sometimes go and find the child who was in the fight and lick him back. It's just normalized. All right, let's look at another case. You catch a goat thief. What do you think is going to happen? And what would the society say? If the LAPOP study asks, is violence justified against a goat thief, a parade of larcenists, what would you think would be the answer? Normalized. It's just a reality. And I use these two examples because I'm going to be making a point a little bit later that I will need Peter's support on, and I'll explain it a little later. But it showed up quite clearly in the evidence that Professor Samson presented, that my recollection is that 28% of persons thought that a man had a right to use violence. Now, that's very high in today's context, that Jamaicans, or was it a study directly for Jamaicans, or was it the Latin American region? For Jamaica. It's still very, it's high. It's high. So the normalization of violence is something that we have to work on. Now, acceptance and normalization of a problem reduces agency. It reduces your ability to change. Think of it this way. You know, why do partners stay in an abusive relationship? You know, sometimes you hear him beat me because him love me. It's the normalization that has just crippled the ability of the person experiencing the harm and the hurt to take charge and say, I am changing. And so to a large extent, it would be the case for the Jamaican society, though it is changing slowly, that because we have accepted it so much, we're just not moving to change, right? And if you think about it, right, we're just coming out of our emancipation period. And so if you just step back a moment and look at our history, you know, from the time Columbus set foot on Jamaica and started to look at this as a colony of exploitation, where we're just coming here for the minerals, and they started to use forced labor on the Tainos that they are found here. It was violence. Violence for economic exploitation. Violence to the point of the extermination of an entire population. And then to replace that population in another violent way, to forcibly take people from another continent and bring them here and keep them in an institutionalized violent situation for, you know, over 300 and odd years. And then even after emancipation, that has been inculcated violence. To the point now where we are recognizing that this issue of violence is creating an existential threat, meaning violence could cause the society to collapse. Not everybody recognizes that. And some people are wedded to violence. So once behavior is normalized, it is only when the behavior reaches crisis that change occurs. Now, let me just say that crisis does not automatically bring change. All right? Societies in crisis can end up in a downward spiral to the point where they just collapse. And that is, we've seen that happening now to many societies who are in crisis but just can't come to a point where they change. So the So the crisis gives the opportunity for change, but that opportunity has to be grasped by leadership. So the society has to have leadership that is going to recognize the crisis as an opportunity and immediately use it to change the situation. So leadership is important as we navigate this crisis of violence. And in my presentation to Parliament in our special sitting in honor of our 60th year, I pointed out how our society would have responded to various existential threats of violence to our society, how the political class responded. We faced an existential threat of political violence to our state. Existential threat. When, you know, coming up to the 1980 election, you know, that several hundred people died. And elections subsequent to that, we had political violence being used as a tool of electing our government. Some of us may not know it, and some of us would have forgotten about it. But we brought an end to that when the political class got together and formed an institution called the Electoral Commission of Jamaica. First was the Electoral Office, now it's the Electoral Commission. And it has had a powerful impact. So today, as I pointed out, and I noticed that Peter Bunting was laughing when I said, you know, one seat separated us and, you know, seamless transition, no issues. We should be very proud of that. We exercised agency and leadership to deal with an existential problem. Now, just reflect for a moment. How many other countries in this region and worldwide has this problem of political violence and how they are struggling to come to grips with it? We have come to grips with it. So I'm saying this to say that the challenge of the use of violence in our society is a huge one, but it is one that we can overcome. If, as a society, the leadership of the society is willing to come to consensus on addressing it. We also addressed another issue, which is extrajudicial killings and police killings in our society. If you were to just reflect back to 20, 30 years ago, when the news report, man was shot and killed, you know, that standard report, gun, firearm recovered, and that was the end of that. Found in bushes. we would, you know, we laugh at it now, but, you know, there's a generation who has no recollection of that. Or the constant, you know, crying of mothers on the radio, you know, a police raid. And now, you know, when I raised the issue in Parliament, and I said, well, we came together and the Parliament passed the Indicom Act. And the Indicom Act was very influential in its impact on the police force. But that's not the complete story of agency. Because the truth is that the police force itself, the JCF itself, recognized that the way in which law enforcement was conducted was not supportive of the objective of providing safety and security to the citizens. And so there were members of the JCF recognized that. And I remember speaking to former Commissioner Williams, who pointed out that, you know, they took great effort in changing the use of force policy to control and regulate how the security force would use force without violence, and how to ensure that force is proportionate to the threat. So all around we are seeing agency, the internal ability to change one's circumstance being exercised. And we should commend the JCF. And I tell you why I say that, because in 2016, when we took over the government, our main focus was how do we reduce crime? And as we analyzed the problem, we recognized that we had to treat with violence as well. And we recognized that the situation required the use of extraordinary powers. So we needed to declare this crime issue as a state of emergency and this violence issue as a state of emergency. Quite separate from the laws and the formal declaration, but just to get into the minds of the people of the society that this shouldn't be normal and we need to act in an emergency way to address it. And we said, all right, if we're going to use these emergency powers, then we could not have it that they are used in a violent way, because the history of the use of emergency powers has always been associated with some form of violence. And so you would note that we have used emergency powers, and the complaint has not been about violence. The complaint has been about rights and whether or not it meets the constitutional framework. Now, that in itself is a change, right? So our security forces have been able to conduct their security operations with minimal violence. And if you look at all the reports of Indicom and all the other reports, you would see that there has been a substantial decline in both fatal shootings and extrajudicial killings. We still have a problem, and it really grates me. It just hurt my heart when I see the citizens and the security forces in conflict, particularly when our women get into conflict with the security forces. And I've been talking with the commissioner about this as to how we can educate our public to have a different kind of interaction with the police. I was recently in central Kingston, and the young lady pointed out, that the police, they're not treated with respect. And that's the core of the problem. That is the core of the problem. It's a respect issue. Not only is it that the police, may come up to them and say, yeah, I'll go over there, sir. But it is also the fact that the citizens hurl expletives wantonly at the police and harass them when they are doing their jobs. Now, the professionals ought to be able, and it's a professional force, to filter that out and continue to do their jobs. But you will never be able to always take the security forces out of the context of the society. And so it is important that we treat with this issue of aggression around the use of authority. So, I mean, that's a whole different subject. But the point that I'm making is that the security forces are transforming the way in which they use force such that they regulate it so that it doesn't become violent force or disproportionate force. And I think that it is still a work in progress, but it is something that we can look at as having achieved that over the last decade to treat with another form of violence, and that is state violence. There are still other elements of state violence that we need to treat with. We need to treat with state violence in our schools, whether it is between students and teachers or students and students, and we need to treat with state violence in our other institutions which hold citizens either as children home or prisons or other such entities. we have legislation in place, certainly for children's homes and for others in state care, but I think greater attention and enforcement is needed to ensure that violence coming from state actors are minimized. And I think that's a very important first step. So we can do it. We have shown that we have the capacity to do it over the years. So we're standing in this moment showing that we are going to do it. We're going to treat with this business of social violence in a meaningful way. So when the historians go to write the history 20, 30 years from now, they will look back at this moment as pivotal. Now, why is this moment pivotal? Well, firstly, in a democracy, it's very difficult to make change unilaterally. In a democracy, you need consensus. And I must say that all the changes that we have made, and I pointed out 3 major ones in our country. The Electoral Commission, that was built on, Peter, consensus. P.J. Patterson, Edward Seaga, and all the others who worked towards that, including Hugh Scherer's intervention and so forth. On the Indico matter, that was, a consensus. Bruce Golding, Prime Minister, led that, but Peter Phillips was very supportive in getting that done. On our fiscal rules, again, that was consensus. On violence, we will need a political consensus. Now, there are many lessons to be learned about building consensus. One, in order for the political actors to put aside their interests, they will need to be confronted with the facts. That's number one in building consensus. On the crime issue, Peter, I think we need to spend a little bit more time in analyzing what are the factual situations so that the concerns you have, the concerns I have, can be truly analyzed. We haven't been able to get to political consensus. We are attempting it. We have a framework in place. We have CMOC, but we haven't reached genuine consensus on how to tackle crime. I'm hoping that having taken this approach, where we have asked an independent body, all the persons who are on this body are strong, independent persons who can analyze the data and say to the government, here is what needs to be done, and to the opposition as well, here is what needs to be done. The political class, confronted with this factual set of data, recommendations, and conclusions, would then have to look at it and come to a reasonable understanding as to what we need to implement. It's very important because not everything that we need to implement can be enshrined in law. So there are some things that you can put in law, but governments change and the priority for enforcement can change. Right? So, but you need to have consensus. And once you have that underpinning consensus, then you can really make the change. So I'm using this platform to say to our counterparts in the opposition that let us create a space in which the treatment of violence is not contested politically, that we share in the victory of overcoming violence. I think that's the message that I would want to use this launch and platform to say, because that is going to be a signal important achievement for the country, and it doesn't have to be anybody getting any political benefit off of it. It's just something that the nation needs to benefit from. Right? So let's get it done together. That's the intention. Now, obviously, if we are able to treat with violence, then it will have an impact on crime, right? Without question, because as the data is showing, that, violence creates the crime actors. And so you have to treat with the violence so that you have less persons prone to crime in the society. So yes, there will be a knock-on effect for that. The nation should understand that this is not going to be the flip of a switch. It is going to take time. So we're dealing with this from Columbus set foot on Jamaica to now. It's not just going to happen overnight. But if we have the consensus, if people begin to tune themselves to the new narrative, then we can have a change. And I close by saying, I went to the funeral of the 5 persons who were murdered by a family member. And I took the opportunity to talk about violence and what the government is going to be doing. And one of the things that we have to do is to treat with corporal punishment. Now, half the church was looking at me as to what I'm talking about. And the other half was looking, I do agree with you on this corporal punishment thing. It's very important. You can't spare the rod and spoil the child. Now, my job is, sometimes I have to say the uncomfortable truths, the things that people won't agree with, right? It's very dangerous for a politician to do that, but it has to be done, right? You have to change the society. So I said, this business about sparing the rod and spoiling the child, that doesn't make sense. Of course, that's biblical. And then I noticed a caricature in one of our newspapers. But it goes to make the point of the reinforcement of violence. So it's not just, beating the child or the abusive correction of the child. It is that the normalization of it in our religion, in our media, what our grandparents think, that is where we need a change. And if you don't have political consensus, it could very easily be used for political advantage. And that's why we have to take this approach to it, because the use of violence is so deep-seated in our culture that it has to take this kind of consensus to really make the change. And so today is a very important moment, and I hope that we have been able to convey this to the nation, that we are going to overcome violence, to make Jamaica the kind of gentler place that we think of it as. Jamaica, no problem, man. God bless you.
Prime Minister, thank you so much for pulling this all together and ensuring that we have that clarion call for consensus and the way forward. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the time has been far spent. We do have an out-of-town engagement, Prime Minister. And so may I ask Ms. Antoinette Richards, a commissioner from the PIOJ, to come forward, some brief closing remarks. Antoinette.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. The Most Honorable Andrew Holness, Prime Minister of Jamaica, Senator Peter Bunting, representing the Leader of the Opposition. All protocols are observed. Ladies and gentlemen, good day. Firstly, I would like to thank the Prime Minister for establishing the National Commission on Violence Prevention and the support that has been provided as we seek to fulfill our mandate. I would also like to thank the Chair of the Commission and the other members for their commitment to Jamaica, as evidenced in their acceptance to serve on the Ncvp. Thank you to the team in the Ncvp Secretariat, including the interns, for the sterling work they have done, which has made our job as commissioners much easier. Thanks to the many agencies and individuals that have made presentations on the work they have done to the Commission, as we seek to gain a better understanding of what has been and is being done and the various lessons learned. Thanks to the international development partners who have funded initiatives in support of the work of the Commission. And finally, thanks to all those who made today's event possible. Jamaica will not be the place of choice to live, work, raise families, do business, and dare I say retire, if the Jamaican society is not secure, cohesive, and just. However, for us to achieve this, we must be willing to do things differently. The importance and urgency of the current crime situation in the country is recognized, and as a result, the Prime Minister has mandated that the National Commission on Violence Prevention provide evidence-based policy, guidance, and recommendations to the Government of Jamaica on violence prevention and intervention. Mr. Vassell has clearly outlined the scope of work of the Commission, which I'm sure you'll all agree is a lot. Our chairperson, Professor Sams Vaughan, has used the data we have collected thus far to highlight the impact of crime and violence on the Jamaican society, but she has also presented possible risk and protective factors and also prevention and intervention strategies. We have also heard the findings of the research conducted by Dr. Kordesai on violence prevention interventions in Jamaica and the themes that have emerged around programming, so we will look at what is necessary versus sufficient, the issue of coordination and the lack thereof, the targeting of our interventions, and of course, our need to measure our impact, and so the importance of monitoring and evaluation. Please note, it is not our aim to reinvent the wheel, but to draw on international, regional, and local experience to identify what works and what does not as we seek to craft a strategy for implementation. The Commission also recognizes the value of a multi-stakeholder approach to identifying solutions with memberships coming from non-governmental organizations, including faith-based organizations, the private sector, academia, youth, the political directorate, and government entities. However, we, the members of the Ncvp, cannot do it alone, and our Vision 2030 can only be achieved if we all work together to make Jamaica the place of choice to live, work, raise families, and do business. Thank you.
Antoinette, thank you so much for that very brief intervention, vote of thanks, and of course, closing remarks. It's then left to me to say thank you to the audience here. Thank you so much for those who have joined us online and remained online, and of course the media for their coverage. Professor Sams Vaughan has said the way forward, we need to have a symposium and look more in depth at the whole matter. I'm sure in months to come that will happen. And of course, Prime Minister, thank you for your charge again, ensuring that we will do the things that matter to get the results we want. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Have a wonderful day.